The hospital room smelled of cleaner and water, as if the nurse had just been in to mop the floors, but that wasn't the case, as Elizabeth had been sitting in that room for the last 2 hours without moving and no one had been in for some time. She sat in a chair by the hospital bed, looking at James laying there. He had a swollen eye, a bruised cheek, a busted lip, and bandages with patches all over him. If his torso wasn't covered by white sheets, there were at least 3 points heavily bandaged where bullets had been removed from his body. The doctor said it was a miracle he was even breathing. Elizabeth had never considered herself super religious. She had attended church growing up, but fell out of the practice as times became harder and she was forced to pursue less ideal means of making money. What kind of God smiles on that lifestyle, she thought to herself. But now, staring at the broken and near-dead body of her boss and her best friend, maybe more than that, she felt the urge to speak to God again. She prayed, fervently as if God were right there next to her. She'd begged God to heal him, pleaded for another miracle, and yet, of course, nothing happened. What had she expected? That James would open his eyes? Jesus himself would appear and pat her head? No. These were the fantasies of a little girl. The truth was harder to handle than a fantasy, because the truth is something you have to approach yourself. A fantasy you dream up, but truth is something you pursue. And the truth was that James was nearly killed in an attempt to get information. So now she'd have to take up the burden. At first she'd wanted to abandon this job altogether, to give up on finding the bombs. Let the Nazis do what they wanted. Wasn't James's condition proof that they were in too far and now was the time to get out? And ordinarily, that would be what she did. Pull out of the situation before things got worse. That's why she quit singing in the first place. But now? Now she was angry. Sadness and worry had given way to pure rage. How dare they do this to James? Those miserable, stupid, arrogant cowards. She clenched her fists up without thinking and began thinking of all the things she'd do if she could find them. But she again calmed herself, abandoning the fantasy. She glanced up at Troy as he lay there, and she slowly walked over to his bed. She sat down next to him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, perhaps the only spot on his body uncovered by bandages. She then hummed softly an old tune, a song she'd only sung a few times, but it was the same one James had heard the first night they'd met, and it was the one he'd loved the most. "Ma'am?" Elizabeth looked up, blushing and embarrassed to see the doctor entering the room, brushing herself off and pretending she hadn't been doing what she was. She coughed and stroked her hair out of her face to appear professional. The doctor smiled at her, not fooled for a moment. He was an older man, possibly in his 60s. He had balding hair and a small white beard under his chin, with squared glasses on his nose. He was holding a clipboard with a small stack of papers on it. "Have you been here all day?" "I'm sorry, doctor, I was just—" "Are you his wife?" the doctor asked with a knowing smile. Elizabeth blushed at the question and shook her head. "No, I'm his secretary, I suppose." "Well, you show a great deal of devotion for just an employee. I doubt my own wife would have sat around so long if it were me on that bed," the doctor joked, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Hawkins." Elizabeth shook his hand and gave a polite smile. "Elizabeth Frost," she replied, but then turned her attention to James. "Sorry, doctor, but about James?" "Mr. Troy is lucky to be alive at all," Dr. Hawkins answered gravely. "I'm sure the surgeon told you about his predicament." 4 gunshot wounds, several fractures, a broken rib." "Well, that's just most of the severe issues," he grumbled. "Fortunately for you, none of the bullets hit anything vital, and 2 of the bullets went straight through, so there's no shrapnel damage. The other 2 bullets were removed, so he is expected to make a recovery, but recovery will be difficult. He'll likely have some difficulty walking or even eating for a few weeks, maybe even months." "Serves him right, putting himself in danger like that," Elizabeth grumbled. Dr. Hawkins didn't seem to hear. "In any case," he continued, "we're doing all we can, but we need to change his bandage, so I'll ask that you leave the room for a little while. Besides, someone has come to see you." "Me? Who?" "Police Chief Lanier." The chief stood in the lobby with 2 officers with him and 1 nurse. They were speaking to her in soft but hurried tones, and when Chief Lanier saw Elizabeth Frost approaching him, he took off his hat respectfully and bowed his head reverently. "Miss Frost?" he asked. "What do you want?" she asked haughtily, her voice trembling. "James isn't seeing anyone." "I know that. How is he?" the chief asked. Elizabeth wasn't stupid. She could tell that Lanier already knew Troy's condition. He had likely been told by the nurse or one of the other doctors. He was just trying to be polite. Men were usually really polite to Elizabeth when they wanted something from her, or when they were trying to get her to like them. In either case, Lanier was out of luck. This was a game she'd played for a long time. "He'll be fine," Elizabeth said, choking on a sob, bringing her hand close to her mouth to hold back her occasional hiccups of tears. Lanier moved closer, concerned, as Elizabeth began to shiver, as if cold.
"I understand that this is difficult for you, but we need to ask you some questions about the incident."
I don't know how I could help you," Elizabeth finally whimpered. "I don't know anything. James said he was after some people, and Oh, James." She suddenly burst into tears, and the chief wrapped an arm around her, waving for his fellow officers to leave him for a minute. He sank down on a chair and eased Elizabeth down next to him. Elizabeth continued to cry, sobbing and choking on wretched tears of anguish.
If you need some time, we can of course do this later," Chief Lanier whispered. "Why don't you go back home, rest a little while? We can talk when you're feeling better."
"Why would anyone do this to James? He was just investigating, just looking for clues, right? That's what investigators do. James wouldn't hurt anyone," she cried helplessly. Chief Lanier sighed and placed a hand on hers to console her.
James was looking for dangerous people, and they hit him first. Sometimes that happens to private eyes."
"What dangerous people?" Elizabeth asked.
"Possibly Nazi sympathizers in the States. I'm afraid I can't discuss the details, but thanks to James's actions, we now have sufficient evidence to start looking into the matter. We'll find them, Miss Frost, I'm sure of it. In the meantime, I'd be happy to give you a lift home, or perhaps somewhere you'd feel more comfortable," he said with a firm and hopeful grip on her fingers.
Elizabeth knew that expression, the flirtatious one. Typical. The man was still wearing his wedding band, too, of all things, but it wasn't the first time a married man had made an advance on her before. She didn't let up, though. She needed more information, so she didn't break the act. "Nazis!" She grabbed it, disbelief dripping into her voice. "But what are they doing here? Why would James want to go after something so He shouldn't have. James, why would... Oh, James. I told him to go to the police. I told him that this didn't feel right." She bit her lip, holding back another crying fit. Chief Lanier rubbed her back comfortingly.
"It's all right. He did what he thought was right."
"Chief Lanier, if James couldn't stop these people, how will you? Please don't get hurt. Just look at what they did to James."
Now, none of that." Chief Lanier swelled a little at her concern. "It's my job to catch people like Kruger."
"Kruger?" Elizabeth asked.
Chief Lanier frowned quickly and cursed under his breath, clearly realizing he'd dropped a name he shouldn't have. Yes, I'm Rick Kruger," he confessed. This is top secret information, and I'll trust you not to tell anyone. You seem like a sweet girl." He grinned again, trying to butter her up, so he gently ran his finger along her shoulder. "All you need to know is that he's a very bad man, and I'll capture him. Don't you worry."
Elizabeth was barely listening to his boasting anymore. She was processing the name and putting it to memory. "I'm Rick Kruger." She'd heard that name before.
"Now, how about I give you a lift home?" Chief Lanier offered, rising to his feet.
"Actually," Elizabeth whispered, cleaning her cheeks of tears, "if it's all right with you, Chief, I'll go back to James's office. I need to clean up a few things." Before Lanier could protest, she was already walking to the door. "Thank you for your help, Chief. You've been ever so helpful." She then hurried out of the hospital, plotting her next move. She needed information on Emmerich Kruger, whoever he was. She might not be able to catch him, but she'd find him. And she had ways of finding people. James Troy's domain was the thin veil between the law and the common citizen, but hers was that veil beyond it, beyond the rule of law, between the law and the scum who lurked below it. If James couldn't reach Kruger from his domain, she would hunt him from hers. The song that resonated in James's slumber reverberated and sent waves of feeling through his body. It drew into his heart, and he could see it so clearly. That fateful night years ago. That foggy nightclub filled with bootleggers, gangsters, and girls with little self-respect, something they traded for coin and liquor. He remembered the chill of wet clothing, as it had been raining hard outside that night. Or perhaps he was remembering the sweat of running. Or maybe he was just nervous. He'd been called here to meet a client, someone who said she needed his help. He took off his hat, and he remembered finding a chair to sit in. He didn't know who the person was. He had in his hand a letter with instructions on it, to come to the Dual Sticks nightclub and wait for a woman to come out and speak to him. She'd explained it all. He hadn't known what to make of this, but he had done his ass anyway. Confused and unsure of what to do, he waited out the night, enjoying the shows and performances as they came out and ignoring the reprobates and catcalls of drunken fools seeking a pair of breasts and lips to take home. And then he saw the curtains open. He saw the lights go down and the sound soften. She walked out on heels of glass and in a dress that shimmered like it was made of diamonds. She had lightly blue eyeliner, and her long black hair was wavy and adorned her head like a lion's mane. She parted her lips, and when her beautiful eyes fell on James, she formed a smile that stole James's breath. And then she sang.
Tell me just what you want me to be. One kiss, and boom, you're the only one for me. So please tell me why don't you come around no more? 'Cause right now I'm crying outside the door of a candy store. Just takes a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Start with a kiss, we're up to bat. A little bit of lust, a little bit of pain. I'm telling you, my babe, it's all in the scheme of love.
She stepped down off the platform and walked among the crowd. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried across the room with the instruments of the club band like it was part of the cigarette smoke that wafted through the air. Her every soft footstep seemed to chill the air but melt hearts as men all reached out just for a touch of her dress. Even James felt drawn to her, forgetting for a moment why he was here at all. And she continued.
Whatever you make it to be, sunshine set on this cold and lonely sea. So please, baby, try and use me for what I'm good for, and saying goodbye, knocking down the door of your candy store. Just takes a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Started with a kiss, and we're up to bat. A little bit of lust, a little bit of pain. I'm telling you, my baby, it's all in the scheme of love. It's all in the scheme of love.
She approached James, and for the first time, James was dumbfounded as this goddess leaned close and draped a long leg around him, as if straddling him. She then ran her hands along his chest, continuing her song, soft enough not to hurt his ears, but still carrying with enough passion to keep the room caught up in her music.
You roll me, control me, console me, please hold me. You got me, divide me into one.
She paused. The music stopped. No one breathed. Not one movement as she held this note. And then James felt her slip a note into his coat pocket before finally drawing back, letting the moment hold.
So please tell me why don't you come around no more? 'Cause right now I'm down outside that door of your loving soul. Just takes a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It started with a kiss, now we're up to bat. A little bit of lust, a little bit of pain. I'm telling you, my babe, it's all in the scheme of love.
And as she sang, finishing the song, she moved like a ghost back to the stage, out of reach but visible. James sat dumbfounded as she slipped carefully and sensually behind the stage curtains again. Every man in the room jumped to their feet, cheering and yelling for her to come back out. James, meanwhile, took out the note with shaking hands and read what was said to himself. "You're Inspector Troy, yes. Meet me backstage in 10 minutes. Show this note to the bouncer and he'll let you through. If you're the man I've heard you are, I know you can help me. Please, Elizabeth Frost." He stashed the note and rose to his feet, his legs still wobbling from the ecstasy of earlier, but his mind now bent on saving her from whatever she was afraid of, and the song still moving through his veins like blood pumped to his heart. Maybe it was that song now that was keeping him alive as he lay at death's door, all to play another round of this game of love.